Greetings, everyone. Kokou here. And we are doing another episode of the Thursday Thoughts Show. Just want to jump on real quick and let you guys know what we're talking about. We're talking about self-control. And of course, we're talking about self-control as it pertains to the Black equals African community. One of the things that I want to get across in this episode, as you'll see, is that we just have to do better. We have to be better under the circumstances. I look forward to chopping it up with all you guys tonight as we discuss this important Thursday thoughts concept of self-control. If you can hear me, if you're out there and you can hear me, hit 1 in the chat so I can know that you can hear me. And what we'll do is we'll start the show now. And on the other side, we'll get into this discussion.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now your host, whose favorite color is black, Kokou.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Kokou. Just want to remind you guys before we get the show rolling that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network you are invited to tune into.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. We're back. I want to thank those of you who are tuned in, those of you who listen to the playback. I appreciate all of you. Tonight we're talking about self-control, and I think it's an important concept. I was reading a paper recently, one of those John Henrik Clarke papers, where we were talking about African continuity. We were talking about African continuity in those slave revolts in the Caribbean. I see the pro-Black perspective is here saying peace, fam, peace to Oni Tase. And there was a line in there talking about it could have very well been the Berbice Revolution. There was a line in there that says something along the lines of, once those African ancestors of ours who fought, once they went on to have their own areas of land, etc. You could be punished by death if you did the wrong thing against the people. And it was only Tase who was in the chat that night. He said, yeah, you see, we used to govern ourselves. And it's the self-governance that we need now. It's also, we need self-governance and we need that self-control. When you talk about self-control, the first thing we should do is talk about the definition of it. What is self-control? Strictly defined, self-control is the ability to control oneself, in particular one's emotions and desires or the expression of them in one's behavior, especially in difficult situations. Let me read that again. This is important. The strict definition of self-control is the ability to control oneself, in particular one's emotions and desires or the expression of them in one's behavior, especially in difficult situations. Now, if we're being honest with ourselves as Black equals African people, we are in a difficult situation. And the thing that is going to get us through this difficult situation is self-control. What's going to get us through this situation is how we control our emotions, particularly our emotions and desires or the expression of those things amongst our own people. If I was to add to that definition, I would say that self-control is warfare. It's the warfare between your impulses and doing what's right or beneficial. It's the ability to control your emotions, impulses, or behaviors to achieve a greater goal. What is that greater goal? I'll talk about that in a second. Self-control is actually linked to many good things, including success and the ability to achieve goals. I will put this out here early in this brief conversation tonight, that because of a lack of self-control, because of a lack of mindfulness, and we'll talk about mindfulness at the end of the show, this is why we can't achieve the goals that we want. When we look at African leadership on the continent, a lot of those people, those so-called leaders, rightfully is to call them misleaders, a lot of those guys don't have self-control. They sell their people out for European trinkets. They lack self-control. The reason why certain goals can't be achieved on the continent is because the leadership isn't about self-control. The learning curve is here, saying greetings, family. Greetings to the learning curve. That's the revolutionary matron. Y'all know that already. So what does self-control have to do with us? Well, I just give you a couple examples. Why is self-control important? Self-control is important because people who lack self-control often give in to their impulsive behavior and emotions as well. This means that they may make poor choices that harm themselves or others and react poorly when they don't get what they want. When we look at our communities, our so-called neighborhoods, what we see out here for the most part is a lack of self-control by certain segments of our society, which also stands in the way of how we can organize or get organized in our communities. Instead of putting in that time to get organized and to organize ourselves, we actually have to survive the lack of self-control, the lack of impulsive behavior among certain folks within our own society. And now there's reasons for that. We'll talk about it. But we got to push past those reasons if we want to get to where we're going. What you don't understand too, because I hear this talk all the time. Yeah, sure. When we create our nation, we will leave out the folks who ain't about nothing. But what you don't understand is a lot of high functioning people who don't have self-control. So all you're going to end up doing is creating something that's going to collapse on itself because of lack of self-control. Let's get into the practice of self-control. Self-control is an important skill to develop. Let me say that again. Self-control is an important skill to develop because these same emotions occur in any person who feels that their needs or desires are not being met. In other words, you can go with, I think D-Web and them call it the 5% or the 15%. I think it's the 15% D-Web and the matron and them call it. You can go with the 15% and build a nation. Yeah, you can. You can ignore everyone else if you want to. But when those 15% don't get their desires, their needs, and all that met, what's going to happen? You're going to have ruin still. A person who lacks self-control may respond in a variety of ways, including with anger, physical violence, or by turning to unhealthy coping mechanisms. How many great voices have we had who succumb to drugs and addiction of various types? So it's not just about knowledge. It's not just about you understanding what's needed, but you also have to understand what individuals will need as well. We have to get into the practice of being the thing that we want to see ourselves in the future. We have to get into the practice of being the thing that we want to see of ourselves in the future. And now is the time to really do it. Remember, I started this Thursday Vibes show on the topic of abundance mindset. Well, self-control is actually involved in abundance and scarcity mindsets. The difference between a person who is successful in their personal relationships and, say, careers, and one who is not, is their ability of self-control. Self-control is the difference between having an abundance mindset or remaining in scarcity. A lot of our folks, as we see them in the West, especially, lack certain self-control. Control yourself, man. Like, you feel you have to go and sell drugs. Okay, go do that shit away from my children. Have some self-control. You want to make $1, you decide to go down that path, have some self-control. Have a code about yourself. The learning curve says a nation that does not provide for all its people is not a nation. We have to step back, do better, and uphold our duty. That's the comment right there. Matron also says she likes the music in the background. Thank you. That's a new feature in StreamYard, by the way. But I want to touch on what the matron said again. A nation that does not provide for all its people, it's not a nation. We have to step back, do better, and uphold our duty. And we got to get into the practice of that stuff now. This is why Garvey and everyone since has talked about the power of getting organized. Being in organizations teaches you what it takes to build and maintain a nation. What does self-control have to do with Black people? What does self-control have to do? It has everything to do with Black people. Black equals African people. In criminology, That's the study of crime, right? So in black criminology, they tend to look at impulsivity in recent years, right? Again, self-control is a person's capacity to alter one's responses, especially to align with standards, ideals, values, morals, and social expectations. So what standards, ideals, values, morals, and social expectations are we aiming for? What standards, ideals, values, morals, and social expectations are we aiming for? That's nationhood. And nationhood is where we're failing. And so we are in a position where we're the snake biting its own tail. Because we have no nation and we're in and under other people's nations and their rules, etc. We tend to be angry. We tend to act out. And that being angry, that acting out is not channeled correctly. So it's not channeled into building your own. It's channeled into continuing under this man's nation. Self-control is not haphazard. Self-control is not haphazard. Self-control is deliberate. It's a conscious effort. It's an action. When you're out here robbing, killing, stealing, I understand that's what being under another man's nation will do to you. But you ultimately have the choice whether you're going through with that or not. It's called self-control. Govern yourselves. Certain things in our community is supposed to be treasonous. We have the ability to reason and to understand. With that ability, we have a responsibility to do the right thing, especially under this, these conditions that we're under. You don't take another black man's life. You don't rape your women. You don't call them bitches. You don't cope with drugs. So, and I'm talking about making it like a cultural thing. The last thing I'll say before I go to this station ID break. This is the thing that we, the conscious, we're failing too. The Pan-Africanists, or as Oni will call them, the Fan-Africanists. Make sure to check out that series he's doing on his podcast on Sundays. The Fan-Africanists, as we have to say it now, aren't doing anything. They're just talking kumbaya. We're not building institutions and linking these institutions. Staying in America or staying in the West isn't helping us much either, too. And why am I bringing that up? It's the last thing I'll say, and then we'll do a station ID break. Self-control is a limited resource. Self-control is a limited resource. Meaning, it's like a muscle. Your muscles get tired, don't they? You exercise enough, you'll get tired. You exercise self-control enough, and the conditions for which you're trying to maintain that self-control isn't being lifted, it'll eventually wear out. This is how you get guys like a Huey P. Newton doing hard drugs and all kind of stuff. The conditions didn't change. We got to do more. I want to thank all of you who are tuning in, whether you're live, whether you're listening to the playback. I always get people who tell me, oh, I'm sorry I missed it. I was at work. That's fine. At least you checked it out. You listened. Next step, let's get more feedback on this stuff. All right. But again, I go back to what the matron said. A nation that does not provide for all its people is not a nation. You have to step back, do better, and uphold our duty. Let's take this quick station ID break. We'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
And we're back. Again, thank you guys for tuning in. Like I said before, each of these topics, I'm going to try to do like 3 different passes. After I've done enough topics, I'll go back to the first topic, abundance mindset. And I'll do a second pass. And each pass will be more and more African-centered. And the last pass will be more about how these topics really relate to nation building. Self-control is deliberate. It's a conscious effort. It's an action. But it is a limited resource. They did research, right? And they found that self-control plays an important part in the production of violence and other criminal acts. If you're gonna talk about nation building or community uplift or what have you, you're gonna have to, when you create your organizations, your policies, when you design those things, you gotta pay attention to weak self-control, and you have to pay attention to ways to improve it or to counter it or to counter its influences. We don't really talk about that stuff. The basic tenet of black criminology is that blacks, especially black males, have been and continue to be systematically racially oppressed, while whites, especially white males, have been and continue to be embedded within a system of white privilege. Let me say that another way. Black people, being nationless, especially black males, have been and will continue to be systematically oppressed in this white, especially white male nation. The history in this white nation shows that black males experience gendered racial oppression. This gendered racial oppression came about from the days of chattel slavery. Remember when black males were being depicted as violent rapists, the black buck? And that notion persisted through Jim Crow, beyond to today. Today, black men are called super predators in white racial propaganda. They create the circumstances and then label you as a person who did what the circumstances were created to make you do. But again, it's personal choice. And you've heard me talk about this in the past. You've heard me talk about this stuff in the past. And you know what's wild? I watched this guy's videos, Vlad TV. And the thing I always come back to, which is so wild to me, there's black men who go on there, when they were youth, they were terrors. They were terrors for no good reason, really. Some of these guys came up with their mom and their dad. What's this little dude? Charleston White is one of these guys. He had his dad around. He grew up with his mom. He had a brother from a very young age said, "Yeah, when I grow up, I'm gonna kill somebody." Unprovoked. No good reason for saying it. We got to start instilling that self-control in children too, by the way. I'm going to talk about that in the solutions piece at the end. But yes, they created the circumstances. You don't have to follow it. As an old school teacher used to say to my class, my old math teacher in high school used to say to my class when we were acting up, "Are you a man or are you a mannequin?" A mannequin is something that people, in whatever situation or position they want to put them in. Or are you a man who stands on his own? Are you a man or are you a mannequin? The learning curve says the white man celebrates violence. Think about Ben Carson and the violence he talks about in his children's book. I'm not familiar with Ben Carson's children's book, so you'll have to enlighten me a little bit more about that. But I know that dude grew up poor on a project, so I learned about that back in the day. The pro-black perspective says mannequins are definitely majority. Absolutely. Are you a man or are you a mannequin? And I learned that guy, that teacher, we're talking in the 90s, he was screaming that at us in the 90s when we were loud in class or whatever. Don't turn and say, well, I was doing it because so and such. No, are you a man or are you a mannequin? Regardless to what systems, regardless to how they try to herd you down a path, you have to have your own self-control. So I was talking about research and studies and whatnot. Studies also reveal that black male adolescents are more likely to exhibit reactive responses to negative racialized experiences. They take on this hyper-masculine bravado orientation, particularly in the public. James Baldwin said something like, to be in this system is to be angry all the time. That would mean to be taken or removed from the system will make you less angry. But even within the system, this is why I talk about self-control today. Because don't just put it on the system. You have a choice to make as well. Research further suggests that these behavioral responses to unfair treatment may reinforce gendered stereotypes, further increase the likelihood of disciplinary referrals, academic underachievement, and psychological maladjustment among Black males. Research has shown that Black people with strong self-control have better health, relationships, finances, and careers. So it's not for naught. Remember last year I talked about the three things of abundance: health, wealth, and relationships. You have better self-control, you'll have better of those things. Side note. When you have self-control, you're less likely to have problems like overspending or smoking, alcohol or drug abuse, procrastination, bad behavior, unethical, overconsumption, self-control. I was reading this thing the other day. As you know, I read these papers on the Tuesday shows of the Bitter Medicine podcast. I was reading something Dr. John Henry Clark wrote. You know, he was talking about how Africa, being one of the richest, minerally richest continents on the planet, whether Africans knew or didn't know back in the day, they know now, or they ought to know. But the question has always been, since Garvey's time and before, why are Africans so poor? And Clark wrote that Marcus Garvey advocated that Africans control the wealth of Africa. That's also a version of self-control. He went on to say that Garvey taught that control of resources, control of self, control of nation, requires preparation. Garvey was about total preparation. We're in 2022. We still don't have a unified force in Africa calling attention to the need for this kind of preparation. As John Henry Clark wrote, this preparation calls for a new kind of education. If Africans are to face the reality of their survival, self-control is directly related to your survival. I always try to end these episodes with some solutions, and I have a few written down here. But before I do that, let me just read something to you guys. I try not to read anything on this show because I do enough of it on the Tuesday editions of the show. But in Message to the People, Garvey has a chapter, basically talking about living for something, which is what self-control is ultimately about too. Living for something. And he quotes one Ella Wheeler Wilcox, who wrote these stanzas that says, "Have a purpose, and that purpose keep in view, for drifting like a helmless vessel, thou canst never to self be true." And that always stood out to me, but something stood out to me even more. Later on in the chapter, Garvey says, "Always think yourself a perfect being, and be satisfied with yourself unless you are a jellyfish, no backbone. Never allow anyone to convince you of your inferiority as a man. Rise in your dignity to justify all that is noble in your manhood as a race." He finishes off that section by saying, with a poem that says, "My race is mine and I belong to it. It climbs with me and I shall climb with it. My pride is mine and I shall surely honor it. It is the height on which I daily sit." You got to be about something in life. And you have to have the self-control to get to that point, to be about something and to maintain it. Again, I want to thank you guys for tuning in tonight. The Learning Curve he said, when I was 14, I argued with a friend named Bob. Pulling out a camping knife, I lunged at my friend. The steel blade struck its metal belt buckle and snapped. So that's from the Ben Carson book. Oh, this guy really was talking about some violence in that shit. I didn't realize that. Right? But again, if Ben is talking about arguments with Bob, pulling knives and juking people, but he still becomes, this great surgeon, but you guys could say whatever you want to say about him now, having been under Trump and all that stuff. But he was at one point an inspiration, right? But it tells you something about self-control, even in that story. So what are my solutions to this self-control thing? I quickly wrote these down. I'll share these with you. And a lot of this has to do with how I self-govern myself. Be more mindful. Think it through. You have the ability to think before you act. What is this going to lead to? Who's going to be hurt by this, etc.? Think it through. Be more mindful. Number 2, sleep on it. Something I learned, because I'm a notoriously poor sleeper. Since I started having kids, I don't sleep well. Actually, probably more so since I was in college. Staying up nights, studying, and all that kind of stuff. It's just messed up my sleep, and I'm not a good sleeper. And one of the things I learned about that, which is why I try to work on it all the time, is that lack of sleep could lead you to lowered self-control. People suffering from sleep deprivation exhibit high levels of unethical behavior. Who do you know that's bullshitting all hours of the night? Who do you know, like a couple years ago, was a big catchphrase like team no sleep or something. I'll sleep when I die. Who do you know says that shit and does that shit? I'm here in Brooklyn. I could walk out on the block any hour of the night and see black folks outside bullshit. Take your ass to bed. Like the old Caribbean saying, pee and go to bed. Sleep on it. Refresh yourself. Think about what you are about to do. Is gunning down this person making sense? Is selling drugs to this woman making sense? Is raping? Is any of that making sense? Sleep on that shit. You'll realize tomorrow it don't even make sense. Next point is to organize. Organization. Like I said earlier, organization teaches you self-control. Oni is in the chat right now. I bet you Oni will tell you how in an organization, especially as a leader in an organization, you have to have self-control. When you go around other people, say in an organization who are regularly displaying self-control, you too get some act right. You get some act right. Second to last point, help children. Matron was just talking about children's books, right? Ben Carson's children. But help kids. Kids get into all sorts of quote unquote little skirmishes or whatever. Help them get through it. It'll help you too. Help them understand what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. It'll help you too. The Pro-Black Perspective responded to my question. He said, most definitely. You have to have self-control. Lastly, like that paper from Dr. John Henry Clark that talked about the Berbice revolutions and other Caribbean revolutions, and talked about how when these Maroons had their settlements where they lived and self-governed and doled out punishment, even the punishment of death, we understood how to self-govern ourselves. And if you didn't have self-control, you felt the punishment for it. We have to get back to self-governing. You see, under this white man's nation, if you peep something, they let a lot of these nuisances in our communities, they let them run free for a minute. 9 times out of 10, it's not until one of these nuisances mess up and go across town and mess with some white folk, that's when they come in. But while these nuisances were terrorizing and harassing the Black community, they were free to do what they wanted. Again, you could watch these Vlad TV interviews with these guys, Sean Branch and Heirs to Christ and all that stuff. These were young dudes carrying on wild around Black folks. These were young dudes murdering tons of Black people. Wayne Perry and all these guys, right? They are allowed to run around and do that shit because the victims are Black. Self-control, self-governance. I want to thank you guys for tuning in tonight. That's my last word on self-control. I apologize for not presenting last week. I was supposed to do this same topic last week, Thursday. But sometimes things get kind of busy and I didn't have time enough. Oh, actually, I wasn't in a place. I wasn't home to do the show. So my apologies. But please keep tuning in. Spread the word. Come back and drop some comments. Let's talk about it further. Make sure to check out all the other shows on KWAZ Radio. Last thing I'll say before I go. I'm going to be a little bit cryptic because things are still kind of new, but a part of controlling things, a part of controlling yourselves and your nations and etc. You gotta start supporting the things that you like or the things that you think is worthwhile. Because when you don't support those things, and this is a part of self-control too, actually. When you don't support those things go away. Those things will go away, or worse, those things will go to our enemies if we're not careful. So I'll leave it there at that. A little bit of a cryptic message, but you guys will understand soon enough what I'm talking about. You guys be good. Well, I'll see you guys on Saturday for Shoot the Breeze. Join the Discord. The description is down in the the link is down in the description of this episode. Subscribe to the Bitter Medicine Podcast YouTube channel. Subscribe to KWAZ Radio YouTube channel. And I'll see you guys on Saturday for Shoot the Breeze. Join the Discord. Drop your topics. We'll discuss it. All right, guys. You guys be good. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Kokou. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bitamedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Beta Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Beta Medicine Show, Twitter, Beta Meds, Tumblr, Beta Meds, Instagram, Beta Medicine.